I'm so glad you're here tonight, wherever you are, whether it's late evening by a window, or maybe you're just winding down after a long day. So, tonight, we begin with a peculiar corner of history, one that's as oddly soothing as it is strange. How ancient women dealt with something we still know so well, their periods. So, let's dim the lights, maybe put on a soft fan in the background, and just settle in as we glide through a surprising side of ancient life. Of course, we tend to think of history as this grand parade of kings, queens, and epic battles. But just beneath the gilded surface were these incredibly ordinary yet deeply resilient women, handling something so natural and yet so taboo. And before we even get to the specifics, let's just take a slow, easy breath, because this is a story that unfolds in tiny domestic details, sometimes sad, sometimes absurd, but always deeply human. So let's float over to our first figure, a woman we know only by fragments, a shadow in the Egyptian desert. Her name was Meresunk. Now, Meresunk wasn't a queen. No one carved grand statues for her, and she wasn't the subject of 1,000 poems. But we know from a few scraps of papyrus that, like many women, she dealt with cycles that had no easy answer. Imagine being a noble woman, with servants, riches, a fancy house, but still having to deal with blood, discomfort, and the awkward fact that even the pharaoh's daughters weren't immune. Of course, there were no tampons, no pads, just linen and herbs and a lot of guesswork. And so, let's just sit with that for a moment. How even a noble woman in a glittering age of pyramids was still just a woman waiting for her next cycle. Of course, Egypt wasn't the only place where women had to get creative. Let's float over to ancient Greece. Yes, a place that gave us democracy, philosophy, and apparently a whole bunch of myths about menstrual magic. I mean, of course, Plato had opinions about it. Why wouldn't he? And the funny thing is, while men wrote treatises about why periods supposedly made women irrational, women were just quietly dealing with the same biology, only with even fewer options than Meresunk. So, you have these women tucked into their homes, using soft wool or even moss, and just living in this awkward gap between their cycles and the expectations of society. And of course, we can't skip over medieval Europe, because why not take something awkward and make it even more confusing in a world where peasants couldn't even afford a loaf of bread? Women often just had to hide in the shadows. And yes, there were strange superstitions. Women thought maybe a certain herb would soothe them, or a special charm would keep them healthy. But mostly, it was just silence, waiting, and trying to stay out of trouble. So, let's just let that sink in. This strange, overlooked part of history where women were quietly navigating something so basic and so human that even today we hardly give them credit. And now, let's glide over to another royal disaster, because, of course, we haven't even scratched the surface yet. Now, before we wander too far from those dusty Egyptian homes and Greek courtyards, let's spend a little more time with the practical reality of ancient life. Because one of the strange things about history is that people are very good at writing down wars. They are excellent at recording who stabbed whom. They are remarkably enthusiastic about documenting taxes. But when it comes to the daily experiences of ordinary women, history suddenly becomes shy, almost suspiciously shy. It's as if thousands of scribes collectively decided that military campaigns deserved 50 volumes, while half the population's everyday lives could fit into a footnote. So, historians often find themselves piecing together clues: a scrap of fabric here, a medical text there, an offhand comment from a philosopher. And somehow, from all those fragments, a picture begins to emerge. A picture of women quietly solving problems, long before anyone bothered to write detailed instructions. In ancient Egypt, linen was everywhere. The Egyptians absolutely loved linen. If an Egyptian had a problem, the solution involved linen. Need clothing? Linen. Need bedding? Linen. Need something to help manage a monthly cycle? Well, you can probably guess where this is going. Researchers believe many women folded soft pieces of linen into makeshift absorbent pads. Not glamorous, not especially comfortable, but practical. And practicality tends to win when people don't have many alternatives. Of course, ancient Egypt was also unusually advanced in certain areas of medicine. They had doctors, they had medical texts, although some of their treatments occasionally wandered into territory that might politely be described as creative. Ancient medical recommendations often mixed useful observations with pure guesswork. One moment, a physician might correctly identify a symptom. The next moment, he was recommending a remedy that sounds like it was invented during a fever dream. Human history is full of these moments. People trying their best, missing the mark, trying again, and somehow surviving. Meanwhile, Egyptian women continued working. They cooked. They raised children. They managed households. They traded goods. Life didn't stop simply because someone was uncomfortable, which is something modern people occasionally forget. Ancient life rarely allowed for a day off. A farmer couldn't tell crops to pause. A mother couldn't postpone feeding children. A servant couldn't explain to an employer that she needed 3 days of rest and understanding. Well, she could, but the employer probably wouldn't be enthusiastic. So, women adapted. As women have adapted throughout nearly every era of history, now let's drift across the Mediterranean. The sea is calm, the weather is pleasant, and somewhere ahead, ancient Greece is waiting. The Greeks were brilliant in many areas: philosophy, mathematics, architecture, drama. But when it came to the female body, they were less than expert. Greek medical theories often revolved around balancing bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Everything was supposedly connected, at least according to the experts. The experts, incidentally, were almost always men, a fact that becomes increasingly amusing the longer you study history. Many Greek writers described menstruation as a natural process that removed excess blood, which sounds reasonable enough until the theories become complicated. There were even myths claiming menstrual blood possessed mysterious powers. Ancient societies loved assigning magical properties to things they didn't understand. Despite all this theorizing, ordinary Greek women still needed practical solutions. Evidence suggests that wool may have been commonly used. Soft wool could be folded and positioned to absorb blood. Again, not luxurious, but workable. And workable describes a surprising amount of human history. Let's pause and imagine a Greek woman living in Athens around 400 BC. She's busy making sure everyone survives until tomorrow. And while famous thinkers earned statues and admiration, countless women quietly kept society functioning without fanfare, Without recognition, now let's continue our slow journey forward. As centuries passed, something interesting happened. Knowledge traveled, ideas moved, empires expanded. The Roman world inherited many Greek ideas. Sometimes they improved them, sometimes they copied them incorrectly, which is another deeply human habit. The Romans, however, were practical people. They valued solutions. Many Roman women likely used cloth materials similar to those used in earlier societies. Fabric could be washed and reused. Resources were valuable, especially not in households where every item represented labor. And through all of it, women continued adapting, quietly, patiently, month after month, year after year. There is something oddly comforting about that continuity. And as evening settles over our imaginary Roman streets, lanterns flickering softly in the distance, we'll leave these ancient women for now, so settle in, get comfortable, because next, we'll slowly wander into the medieval world, a place filled with castles, monasteries, and enough strange beliefs. Now, as we gently move out of the medieval world, something subtle begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, like dawn spreading across a quiet village. Ideas begin to shift. Old explanations don't disappear overnight, but they start to get questioned, carefully at first, then more openly, and in this slow transition between belief and observation, women's health starts to be seen with slightly clearer eyes. We enter a world where early modern medicine is still far from accurate, but it is beginning to notice patterns. Instead of relying purely on tradition, physicians start to write more detailed case notes. Apothecaries begin to experiment with herbal mixtures in a more systematic way. And for the first time, there is a faint movement toward documenting the female body, not just as a mystery, but as a system, still misunderstood, still heavily interpreted through male perspectives, but at least observed. In many parts of early modern Europe, printed medical books begin to circulate. This alone is a quiet revolution, because knowledge is no longer confined to handwritten manuscripts in monasteries. It can now travel, slowly, imperfectly, but it travels, and with it comes a strange mixture of progress and confusion. Some medical texts begin to describe menstrual cycles with more anatomical awareness. Others still repeat ancient theories as if nothing has changed in 1,000 years. So, you end up with both worlds existing side by side. A doctor in one city may understand basic reproductive biology better than his predecessors, while another still believes in symbolic explanations involving humors. Human progress is rarely clean. It overlaps with its own past. Now imagine a woman living in this transitional period. She might hear one explanation from a physician, another from a midwife, another from her mother or grandmother, and another from a religious authority. 4 different frameworks, all describing the same body, all partially confident, none fully correct, and yet life continues, because regardless of theory, the lived experience does not pause to wait for medical consensus. One of the most interesting developments in this period is the growing role of midwives. Midwives were often the closest thing to practical female medical knowledge. They relied on experience rather than theory, observation rather than philosophy, and while they were not always formally educated, they often had a deeper understanding of everyday female health issues. including menstruation and pregnancy. Their knowledge was not always written down in official texts, but it was passed through practice, through trust, through repetition. Now, as printing spreads further and cities grow larger, something else quietly changes. Privacy begins to matter, slightly more in wealthier households. Textiles improve in quality, and gradually, the materials used for menstrual care begin to evolve. Still cloth, still reusable. We also start to see early attempts at structured hygiene recommendations, not always accurate, but directed toward understanding the body. And throughout all of this, there remains a consistent theme we have seen since the very beginning of this journey. Adaptation across every era, across every society. Women continue to manage a biological reality that never changes its schedule for empires or revolutions. It does not pause for kings. It does not wait for philosophers. It simply continues, quietly, predictably, and universally. So much of human civilization is built on systems that change constantly. Governments rise and fall, religions evolve, languages transform, but the human body remains consistent in its rhythms, and people have always had to work within that consistency, using whatever tools their time provided. Now, as we slowly approach the modern world, things will begin to change more noticeably. Science will become more precise, medical understanding will improve, and products specifically designed for menstrual care will eventually appear. But that is a different chapter entirely. For now, we remain in this quiet space of transition, where old beliefs still linger and new understanding is just beginning to form. In the next part, we will slowly step into that modern shift, where biology finally starts to separate itself from myth, even if only gradually. Now, as we gently move out of the medieval world, something subtle begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, like dawn spreading across a quiet village. Ideas begin to shift. Old explanations don't disappear overnight, but they start to get questioned, carefully at first, then more openly, and in this slow transition between belief and observation, women's health, like so many other areas of life, starts to be seen with slightly clearer eyes. We enter a world where early modern medicine is still far from what we would call accurate, but it is beginning to notice patterns. Physicians start to write more detailed case notes. Apothecaries begin to experiment with herbal mixtures in a more systematic way, and for the first time, there is a faint movement toward documenting the female body, not just as a mystery, but as a system, still misunderstood, still heavily interpreted through male perspectives, but at least observed. In many parts of early modern Europe, printed medical books begin to circulate. This alone is a quiet revolution, because knowledge is no longer confined to handwritten manuscripts in monasteries. It can now travel, slowly, imperfectly, but it travels, and with it comes a strange mixture of progress and confusion. Some medical texts begin to describe menstrual cycles with more anatomical awareness. Others still repeat ancient theories, as if nothing has changed in 1,000 years. So you end up with both worlds existing side by side. A doctor in one city may understand basic reproductive biology better than his predecessors, while another doctor in a neighboring region still believes in humors. Human progress is rarely clean. It overlaps with its own past. Now imagine a woman Living in this transitional period, she might hear one explanation from a physician, another from a midwife, another from her mother or grandmother, and another from a religious authority. 4 different frameworks, all describing the same body, all partially confident, none fully correct, and yet life continues. Because regardless of theory, the lived experience does not pause to wait for medical consensus. One of the most interesting developments in this period is the growing role of midwives. They were the closest thing to practical female medical knowledge. They relied on experience rather than theory, observation rather than philosophy. They had a deeper understanding of everyday female health issues, including menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth. Their knowledge was not always written down, but it was passed through practice, through trust, and this kind of knowledge tends to survive even when it is not formally recognized. Now, something else quietly changes. Privacy begins to matter slightly more in wealthier households. Textiles improve in quality. Materials used for menstrual care begin to evolve. Still cloth, still reusable, but increasingly refined in texture and availability. We also start to see early attempts at hygiene recommendations. Not always accurate, not always safe, but at least directed toward understanding the body rather than purely controlling it. Throughout all of this, there remains a consistent theme we have seen since the very beginning of this journey. Adaptation across every era, across every society. Women continue to manage a biological reality that never changes its schedule for empires, wars, or revolutions. It does not pause for kings. It does not wait for philosophers. It does not care about political borders. It simply continues, quietly, predictably, and universally. And perhaps that is the most striking thing when you step back and look at the full span of history. So much of human civilization is built on systems that change constantly. Governments rise and fall. Religions evolve. Languages transform. But the human body remains consistent in its rhythms. And women have always had to work within that consistency, using the tools their time provided. Now, as we slowly approach the modern world, things will begin to change more noticeably. Science will become more precision, medical understanding will improve, and products specifically designed for menstrual care will eventually appear. But that is a different chapter. For now, we remain in this quiet space of transition, where old beliefs still linger, and new understanding is just beginning to form as the world moves forward, industrially, politically, inside homes. Life continues in its familiar rhythm, steady, uninterrupted, human. And in the next part, we will slowly step into that modern shift, where biology finally starts to separate itself from myth, even if only gradually. Now, as we gently step into the modern world, the pace of change begins to feel different. Still not instant, still uneven, but noticeably faster than anything we've seen so far. It's as if history, after moving in slow, steady rhythms for thousands of years, suddenly starts to pick up small bursts of acceleration. And in this shifting landscape, women's health begins to move out of the shadows, moving into something closer to science. Not perfect science, but at least measured science. By the 18th and 19th centuries, medical understanding starts to change in a more structured way. Hospitals begin to develop more standardized practices. anatomy becomes a serious field of study, and physicians, for the first time, are able to examine the body with tools that are slightly more accurate than pure speculation. Still, even in this period, old beliefs do not disappear. They linger, sometimes inside medical textbooks, sometimes inside cultural attitudes, and sometimes inside the advice given to women in everyday life. So what we see is not a clean break, but a layered reality. Old ideas sitting next to new discoveries, side by side, competing, confusing, and slowly, gradually, one beginning to outgrow the other. During this time, menstruation begins to be described more consistently in medical literature as a biological process tied to reproduction. This might sound obvious today, but in historical context, this was a significant shift because for centuries, explanations had mixed biology with morality, superstition, and symbolic interpretations. Now, slowly, those layers begin to peel apart, at least in academic circles. In everyday life, however, things change more slowly. Most women are still relying on cloth-based solutions. Reusable materials remain common because industrial manufacturing of personal hygiene and products is still far away. So, daily life remains surprisingly familiar in its practical reality. Clean cloth, washing, reusing, adapting, again and again. What begins to change more noticeably is access. Access to better materials, access to medical advice, access to cleaner environments. So the experience is not uniform. A woman in a growing industrial city may have slightly different options than someone in a rural village, and this difference becomes more pronounced as time moves forward. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we begin to see the first real emergence of commercial menstrual products. Early sanitary napkins appear in industrialized countries, initially simple, often bulky by modern standards, but revolutionary for their time, because for the first time, menstrual care is being designed as a dedicated product rather than improvised from household materials. This is a major shift in human history, not because the biology has changed, but because the response to it has become industrialized. And with industrialization comes another shift. Conversation begins, slowly, to move out of pure silence, still not openly discussed everywhere, still surrounded by discomfort, but gradually becoming more visible in advertising and public health. And this visibility matters, because once something becomes visible, it becomes easier to improve. And as we move further into the modern era, science continues refining understanding. Hormones are identified, the endocrine system is mapped, menstrual cycles are studied in detail rather than generalized theory. Medicine becomes more precise. Data replaces assumption, and slowly, the mystery that once surrounded the process begins to fade. But what remains consistent across all these eras, ancient, medieval, and modern, is human adaptation. Across every century, women have lived through the same biological rhythm, while society around them changed constantly. Empires rose and fell, cities expanded, technology transformed daily life beyond recognition. And yet this one part of human experience continued its steady pattern, unaffected by historical drama, and perhaps that is why looking back at it across time feels so powerful, because it reminds us that beneath all the complexity of history, there are simple, shared experiences that connect people across thousands of years. Different worlds, Same bodies, same cycles, same quiet resilience. And as we begin to close this long journey through time, we leave behind not just a history of medicine, but a history of endurance. Not loud, not celebrated in monuments, but deeply human. And in the final part, we will gently step back and reflect on what this long, quiet story really tells us about people, time, and everyday strength. Strength that history often forgets to highlight. We will look back one last time at the path we've traveled. Now, as we arrive at the end of this long journey, it's worth slowing down just a little more. Because history, when it's told in textbooks, often feels loud. Kings, wars, revolutions, inventions, dates that must be remembered, events that changed borders and shaped nations. But the quieter parts of history, daily life, private struggles, ordinary biology, those rarely get the same attention, and yet they make up most of human existence. What we've been following across thousands of years is not just a story about one biological process. It's a story about how humans respond to something they cannot control, and how every era, no matter how advanced or underdeveloped, has tried to make sense of it using whatever tools were available at the time. Ancient societies used linen, wool, herbs, and tradition. Medieval societies added superstition, religion, and fragmented medical theory. Early modern societies began to introduce observation, writing, and early scientific thinking, and the modern world finally brought industrial design, medical research, and open conversation into the picture. But through all of that change, one thing never actually changed: the lived experience. Because no matter the century, no matter the culture, no matter the level of medical understanding, human beings still had to navigate their bodies within the limits of their environment. And that often meant improvisation. It meant adaptation. It meant dealing with discomfort quietly while life continued moving forward around them. And perhaps that is the most understated truth of this entire topic. Progress in history is not only measured by kings, empires, or discoveries, it is also measured in small, everyday improvements that make life slightly more manageable for ordinary people. A better material, a safer understanding, a little less confusion, a little more comfort. Now, as we step back from this entire timeline, it becomes clear that what we've really been looking at is not just history, it's continuity, a thread that runs through every generation, unbroken, uncelebrated, but always present. And if there is one final thought to leave you with, it is this: history is not only what happened in palaces and battlefields, it is also what happened in kitchens, in homes, in quiet rooms, where nobody wrote anything down. And those moments, though often forgotten, are just as real as anything carved into stone. So as we gently close this story, there is no dramatic ending, no final revelation, just a quiet recognition that behind every era we study, there were millions of ordinary lives being lived, with patience, resilience, and quiet strength. And maybe that is what makes history feel less distant and more human. So for now, we'll leave it here. Let the story settle. Let the silence return. And whenever you're ready, we can explore another forgotten corner of the past together. Medieval women were expected to be quiet, useful, and grateful, which is adorable in the same way a wolf asking a sheep to relax is adorable. In reality, they were doing the work that kept households, farms and dynasties from collapsing into decorative dust. They cooked, spun, brewed, harvested, nursed, negotiated, and endured a legal system that often viewed them as both valuable and inconvenient. Most women in medieval Europe lived in the countryside, where life was built around manors, estates, and endless labor. They were not idle observers of history. They were part of the machinery of survival, helping with agriculture, food processing, animal care, and the many dull but necessary tasks that made it possible for everyone else to pretend society was organized. The romantic version of the Middle Ages tends to skip that part because mud, labor, and exhaustion are not especially flattering in stained glass. The legal side was, naturally, a bit of a mess. Early medieval law codes often treated women as people who needed protection, control, and supervision all at once, which is a very efficient way to turn human beings into administrative problems. Women were prized in some contexts, but they were also described as liabilities, financial burdens, or vulnerable points in the family honor system. So yes, society needed women very much. It also spent a lot of time acting offended that they existed with opinions. Marriage made things even more complicated. In many places, a married woman's legal and economic status changed once she married, and her ability to act independently could be limited by local custom or the expectations of male guardianship. But that did not mean women disappeared from public life. In many medieval settings, wives still participated in trade, household business, debt disputes, and daily economic life, especially where local custom allowed more flexibility than formal legal theory pretended to. Medieval reality, as usual, was less tidy than the law books would like. And then there were widows, who often become the most interesting women in the whole medieval system because widowhood could bring a degree of independence that marriage did not. A widow might control property, run a business, manage land, or defend her rights in court, which is probably why so many people in power found them so irritating. A woman with no husband and actual legal competence was basically medieval society's version of an unscheduled software update. For noble women, the stakes were different, but no less exhausting. They were expected to produce heirs, arrange alliances, manage households, oversee servants, and maintain the family status with the emotional serenity of a saint and the logistical skills of a professional administrator. Some became regents or estate managers when husbands were absent or dead, which meant they could be running entire regions while being told, in principle, that women were naturally unsuited to authority. Medieval politics loved a contradiction almost as much as it loved a marriage treaty. Even religion did not remove women from practical life, though it tried very hard to define their place. Nuns lived under strict rules, but convents could also become places of learning, administration, and influence. Religious ideals often praised female humility and obedience, but actual women kept showing up in records as organizers, donors, workers, litigants, and household heads. It turns out that reality was stubborn enough to keep interrupting theory. So when people ask why medieval women would have been difficult to handle, the answer is simple. They were not ornaments. They were laborers, managers, mothers, traders, widows, noble operators, and survivors in a society that needed them everywhere and trusted them nowhere. That combination tends to produce a woman who is practical, sharp, and deeply unimpressed by nonsense, which, honestly, seems fair. Women in the medieval world were not passive, delicate, or ornamental. They were expected to labor, bear children, manage homes, and in some cases run estates, trade, or communities, which made them far more central to society than the usual women were just there summary suggests. A big part of the difficulty was that medieval society wanted women to be essential but controlled. Law codes and social customs often limited women's independent legal power, especially after marriage, while widowhood or specific local customs could sometimes create more room for autonomy. So the same system that depended on women also kept trying to file them into neat categories, which women repeatedly refused to remain in. And then, because medieval life could never simply stay in one lane, some women moved from household survival into something much more politically inconvenient: power. Queens, regents, noble mothers, and elite widows could end up governing lands, advising rulers, arranging alliances, and keeping dynastic machinery from falling apart when the men were dead, absent, young, or busy, being spectacularly inadequate. Female rulership in medieval Europe was not the norm, but it was certainly real, and it was usually justified as a temporary duty, which is one way of saying, fine, you may hold the kingdom, but only until a proper man is available. That arrangement created a very specific kind of woman. She had to be politically intelligent, publicly composed, and relentlessly useful. A queen or regent could not afford to be sentimental in the way court literature liked women to be. She had to negotiate with nobles, manage succession, protect her children's claims, and act with enough authority to be respected while still pretending not to enjoy the authority too much, because heaven forbid a woman in power seemed to notice she was in power. Some of these women were astonishingly capable. Medieval Europe produced women who ruled as queens, empresses, and regents with enough force to reshape politics around them. Their authority often depended on custom, kinship, and the political necessities of the moment. But once they had a foothold, they could be formidable. The court might have preferred a graceful figurehead, but instead it got a woman who understood leverage, marriage diplomacy, and factional survival better than half the men complaining about her. Female regency is especially telling because it reveals how medieval power actually worked. A woman could govern during a king's minority or absence, but her power was often framed as guardianship rather than rule. That meant she was supposed to be motherly, temporary, and obedient to the realm's real interests, which conveniently meant the interests of the men around her. Still, regents could and did use those opening to appoint allies, stabilize governments, and maneuver through court politics with a patience that probably made everyone else feel personally insulted. Meanwhile, outside the palace, women in towns and cities were carving out roles in trade and craft. They were not just domestic assistants. They worked in markets, helped run workshops, sold goods, and participated in urban economies in ways that made them visible and indispensable. If you are imagining medieval women as delicate and sheltered, the marketplace would have corrected you immediately. Medieval urban life was noisy, practical, and commercial, and women were very much part of the business of keeping money moving. Of course, once women became visible, medieval society sometimes responded with anxiety, suspicion, or moral commentary because that was one of its favorite hobbies. Women who knew herbs, health, childbirth, or household remedies could be respected locally and distrusted institutionally at the same time. A woman might be the person everyone called for care and comfort, and also the person some authority figure eyed suspiciously for being competent in a way that did not require male supervision. Truly, a scandalous arrangement. So the deeper truth here is simple. Medieval women were not hard to handle because they were irrational or delicate or mysterious. They were hard to handle because they were necessary, capable, and persistent in a world built to minimize them while depending on them anyway. That tension produced women who could endure labor, preserve households, manage estates, and occasionally run kingdoms, all while being told to stay in their place, which naturally only made them more interesting. Medieval women also had to live inside a world that kept circling back to religion, inheritance, and the body, because apparently one complicated system was not enough. Church ideals praised female humility and obedience, but real women kept showing up as mystics, patrons, caretakers, and writers, which is one reason medieval records are so full of contradiction and so light on consistency. For women in religious life, convents could be restrictive, but also surprisingly powerful. Some women found education, manuscript work, and intellectual community there, and the great female visionaries of the period used religious language to carve out an authority that men could not entirely ignore. That does not mean it was easy. It means they learned how to operate inside a system that thought it was supervising them while they were quietly learning how to influence it. Inheritance was another source of endless medieval awkwardness. Women could inherit property in some contexts, but the rules varied by status, local custom, and marital situation, and sons were usually favored when the law wanted things to stay simple and male. Widows often had the strongest position because widowhood could preserve or restore a woman's control over land and income, while married women frequently saw their property power narrowed by the legal authority of husbands. That made widowhood one of the few moments when a woman could suddenly become much more autonomous than the society around her liked to admit. A widow might manage an estate, supervise tenants, handle accounts, or make legal claims on property, which meant she could become genuinely influential in local society. Medieval Europe kept trying to define women through dependence and then kept being surprised when one of them ended up running the place after a husband died. Let's float over to daily minutiae because the little things are where medieval women quietly outperformed everyone's expectations. Daily survival was a sequence of repetitive, exhausting tasks that required planning, skill, and a stubborn refusal to be sentimental about work. Spinning and weaving alone could eat whole days. Cloth had to be produced, repaired, and stretched into every piece of the household's life, from clothing to bed covers to sacks for grain. A woman who could spin well was literally keeping the economy from exposing everyone's ankles to the cold. Food was another endless project. Grain needed grinding, bread needed baking, dairy needed turning into cheese or butter, and preservation required knowledge of salting, smoking, and pickling that would put a modern cookbook to shame. Brewing was often the domain of women. Ale was a daily staple and safer than water. So if a woman brewed well, she was quietly central to the health of her household and probably everyone else's on the lane. That skill also gave many women a little extra income or bargaining power in local markets, which again provoked both appreciation and suspicious commentary from authorities who liked tidy hierarchies. Childcare was relentless and risky. Infant mortality was high, and pregnancy itself carried a real danger for mothers. So women's lives were often punctuated by births, losses, and the constant small crises that came with caring for many children and extended kin. Breastfeeding, managing diets, treating common illnesses with herbal remedies, and improvising care when a local healer was unavailable. These were everyday acts of expertise. The emotional labor was constant, but unrecognized in official records, which preferred legal lists to human details, a preference historians have cheerfully been trying to correct. Medical knowledge is worth a quiet aside. Many women were midwives or household healers, using herbal lore, poultices, and experience to handle injuries and common illnesses. That practical medicine was indispensable, even if the learned medical establishment sometimes sneered at women's remedies. When epidemics hit, these practical skills could mean the difference between a village surviving or collapsing into more desperate poverty. Of course, competent women healers could also draw suspicion when authorities looked for scapegoats after crises, which is why the line between respected healer and accused witch could wobble unpredictably in later medieval centuries. Economically, women participated in trade and production in ways historians once minimized. In towns, women might run stalls, be partners in family workshops, produce textiles for market, or act as petty traders. In rural settings, they managed household economies, which included selling surplus produce, hiring labor, or negotiating with tenants. Widows, especially, could become active economic agents, stepping into roles that required legal and financial competence. So, while the legal theory often painted women as dependent, the economic practice often showed them as active market participants. Social networks were another key resource. Women maintained family connections, arranged marriages, mediated disputes, and managed patronage for their kin. That social labor translated into political influence, especially in noble circles where marriages and alliances could shift the balance of power. Even among peasants, a woman who could navigate local obligations and favors was indispensable. Power in the Middle Ages was very often relational, and women were experts at building and sustaining those relations. Finally, there is temperament and culture. Medieval literature and clerical writings liked to imagine women as morally frail or temptresses, which is less history and more a moral panic with a quill. The real medieval woman was culturally powerful in quieter ways. She shaped household rituals, managed festivals, preserved oral traditions, and transmitted skills across generations. Those cultural roles are slow, accumulative, and therefore easy for a patriarchal system to overlook until someone needs a savvy manager, a healer, or a negotiator, and suddenly the system remembers that these women have always been doing the necessary work. So daily life made medieval women formidable out of necessity. They were skilled, practical, and often quietly authoritative. The kind of people who would not tolerate nonsense for long because nonsense cost bread. And when you consider all of that together, it becomes obvious why medieval women were not people you could comfortably handle. If your handling involved assumptions of passivity and obedience, they were too busy running the place. Now let's drift into the part where medieval women become even more annoying to simplistic history because they were not just household workers or noble ornaments. In towns and guilds, women could trade, craft, and manage businesses, sometimes independently and sometimes under frustrating layers of legal restriction. The record shows women as brewers, bakers, textile workers, sellers, scribes, teachers, healers, and all kinds of laborers, which is a polite way of saying the medieval economy was absolutely not run by men alone, no matter how much they preferred that story. Urban life gave women more visibility, but it did not magically make the system fair. In some places, women could be masters of crafts, while in others, they were admitted only under special conditions or pushed into narrower roles. Widows often had the strongest practical position because they could continue a husband's business or use guild rights in a limited way if they had the right journeyman or local support. Medieval law kept trying to make women structurally secondary, and commerce kept replying, yes, but she still runs the shop. This is also where the social suspicion gets funny in a tired, depressing way. Women who sold, bargained, measured, and collected money were not treated with universal admiration because visible economic competence tends to make people nervous when they are committed to patriarchy. A woman who could negotiate debt, keep accounts, and hold a market stall was useful, but she was also one small step away from being labeled difficult, unfeminine, or morally suspect, depending on who was irritated that morning. Meanwhile, literature and church writing kept feeding the idea that women were somehow uniquely troublesome. Medieval anti-feminist texts recycled old jokes and accusations about women being talkative, vain, greedy, manipulative, or spiritually weak, which says more about male anxiety than female behavior. The nice thing about these texts, from a historian's point of view, is that they accidentally prove how present and influential women actually were. Nobody writes that much about irrelevant people unless they are deeply bothered by them. And yet the contradiction remained the same everywhere. Women were essential in households, essential in the marketplace, essential in religious life, essential in elite succession, and essential in local survival. But official culture often preferred to describe them as dependents whose value came from service to men. It is a very medieval trick, really. Depend on women for everything, then write treatises explaining why they need supervision. By this point, the pattern should feel familiar. Peasants, merchants, widows, queens, nuns, healers, medieval women kept showing up in places the system said they should not be, and the system kept adjusting around them. They were not passive recipients of history. They were agents moving through it with labor, intelligence, and the occasional excellent ability to outlive everyone's assumptions, which is probably why the most honest answer to the whole topic is that medieval women were not difficult because they were inherently wild. They were difficult because they were real. So after all that, what remains is the simplest and most annoying truth of the entire subject. Medieval women were everywhere. They were in fields, workshops, kitchens, convents, marketplaces, manor houses, court chambers, and legal records, and the Middle Ages functioned because they were there doing the unglamorous work that historians are forever trying to compress into one tidy sentence. The nice version of history says they were supportive. The more accurate version is that they were structurally indispensable. That indispensability came with constant pressure. Women were expected to be modest, fertile, obedient, laboring, religious, and socially careful, all while absorbing the consequences of war, inheritance disputes, illness, and family instability. If they were poor, they worked. If they were noble, they negotiated. If they were widowed, they managed. If they were in a convent, they organized. Whatever the category, the work never really stopped. And still, the medieval woman kept becoming more than the people around her expected. She could preserve property, run households, guide children, produce cloth, sell goods, write letters, shape politics, and hold communities together through sheer competence. The men of the age often wrote as if women were a problem to be explained, but the records keep showing that women were actually one of the main reasons the whole system kept moving at all. Very rude of them, honestly. So the final answer to the title is not that medieval women were impossible to handle, it is that they were impossible to reduce. They were not passive, not simple, and not secondary in any meaningful sense, except the one medieval elites kept trying to invent. They were practical, resilient, and very often more capable than the institutions built to contain them, which, in a world of kings, priests, and chronic underperformance, is just a little embarrassing for everyone else. By the end of the medieval period, women's lives still looked constrained on paper, but in practice, they had spent centuries improvising around every restriction society invented for them. They were still being judged by marriage, motherhood, class, religion, and reputation, but they were also steadily shaping local economies, household politics, religious culture, and dynastic survival. Medieval Europe did not hand them freedom, so they built influence wherever they could find a crack in the wall. That is why the subject never really resolves into a simple complaint. Medieval women were not just oppressed, though they certainly were. They were also indispensable, resilient, and often far more capable than the systems around them were prepared to admit. In peasants' fields, in merchants' stalls, in convent scriptoria, in manor courts, and in royal chambers, women were doing the work of continuity. The Middle Ages would have looked much cleaner on the page without them, but it would also have stopped functioning. So that is the last little truth to carry with you as the lights fade down. The medieval world was built to control women, but it depended on them to survive, and that makes the title almost funny in a bleak, historical way. You could not really handle medieval women because they were already handling everything else. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a very small village in ancient Gaul, which is exactly the sort of place history likes to romanticize until you remember. It was mostly mud, occupation, politics, and people trying not to get bored to death. Settle in, dim the lights, and let's drift into the slightly ridiculous world behind Asterix and Obelix, those two comic book troublemakers who turned Roman history into a long-running bedtime argument with helmets. The stories are set in 50 BCE in Roman-occupied Armorica, and every tale starts from the same basic arrangement. The Romans are everywhere. The village is annoying, and somebody is about to regret underestimating a very stubborn bunch of Gauls. Now, the first myth behind Asterix and Obelix is that the comics are merely silly fantasy with a few historical costumes thrown on top. They are not. They are deeply rooted in real ideas about Gaul, Rome, resistance, and French identity, even when they are being gleefully unserious about all of them. Asterix was created by René Goscinny and Albert Uderzo, and the series uses historical settings, Roman figures, Celtic imagery, and national stereotypes to build a world that is both absurd and weirdly observant. In other words, it is historical fiction that is constantly winking at you from behind a tree. Asterix himself is the easiest myth to read. He is tiny, clever, and undefeated by the assumption that size equals importance, which is a very satisfying insult to the ancient world, and frankly, to many modern ones as well. He represents the Gauls as resilient, resourceful, and annoyingly difficult to absorb into the Empire's plans. That is not a random choice. The comics tap into a French memory of the Gauls as ancestral figures, a people who were imagined as proud, unruly, and not especially eager to be managed by outsiders. Obelix is the other half of the joke, though joke feels too light for a man whose entire character is a permanent monument to childhood overindulgence. He is huge, superhumanly strong, deeply fond of food, and permanently barred from the magic potion because he fell into the cauldron as a child and already received a lifetime dose of strength. It is a myth in character form, the unstoppable simple giant, part folk hero, part comic sidekick, part warning about what happens when a little boy gets into the wrong cauldron and nobody intervenes quickly enough. But beneath the cartoon logic, the comics draw from real historical imagery. Ancient Gaul was not a single nation so much as a region of Celtic peoples with diverse tribes, customs, and political structures. Julius Caesar's account of the Gallic Wars shaped much of the later image of Gaul in the Roman imagination, though his version was obviously written from the perspective of the man doing the conquering. That means Asterix is not simply history with jokes. It is history filtered through later myth, national memory, and comic exaggeration, which is very on brand for the ancient world, to be honest. The village itself is another important myth. In the comic, it stands as the one tiny place that refuses to surrender to Rome. Historically, that is not how conquest works, but symbolically, it is perfect. The village becomes a miniature fantasy of resistance, identity, and collective stubbornness. Every feast at the end of each story reinforces that idea. The Romans may occupy the region, but the village still has its own culture, rituals, food, and social bonds. It is basically the same joke repeated forever, and somehow it never stops working. Now, let's float over to Caesar, because the man is the great shadow behind the entire setting. In the comics, Julius Caesar is often treated with a mix of grandeur and exasperation, which is probably fair. He is the Roman machine personified, the elegant face of a vast imperial project that expects the world to cooperate politely. In the real history behind the stories, Caesar's conquest of Gaul was the kind of event that turned the region into a Romanized landscape over time. even if the transition was messy, uneven, and not nearly as neat as school maps would like. This is where the second myth comes in, that Romanization erased the world of the Gauls overnight. It did not. Real Gaul became Gallo-Roman gradually through cultural blending, military control, trade, urban growth, and the slow adjustment of local life to Roman power. The comics, of course, turn that huge historical process into a recurring slapstick stalemate. Rome is always trying to impose order, the village is always refusing to participate, and somehow that looping resistance feels emotionally true, even when it is historically impossible. The creators also understood that Asterix needed more than politics. He needed folklore, caricature, and a whole lot of food. That is where the famous wild boar comes in. In the books, boar is the meal of choice, a recurring symbol of local identity and rustic abundance. It gives the village a ritual rhythm: hunt, feast, bicker, repeat. And because the series loves irony, the people who appear most primitive in Roman eyes are usually the ones with the best social cohesion and the least patience for imperial nonsense. The druid, Getafix, is another mythic anchor. Druids in ancient Gaul were priests, judges, and keepers of knowledge, and the comic turns that historical role into one of quiet authority and chemical usefulness. Getafix brews the magic potion that lets the villagers briefly become unstoppable, which is a beautiful way to turn Celtic wisdom into narrative mischief. The potion is not just a plot device, it is the comic's way of saying that local knowledge, cultural memory, and community discipline can outlast brute force, at least in story form. The myths also extend into the way different peoples are portrayed. The series is famous for sending its heroes across the world and exaggerating local traits for comic effect. That is not historical accuracy, obviously, but it does reflect a very old storytelling habit. Foreigners become mirrors, each one a slightly distorted lesson about identity. The Romans are bureaucratic, the Gauls are stubborn, the Egyptians are puzzle-like, the Britons are reserved. The whole series is built on the idea that history is not only about events, but about how people imagine themselves and everyone else. And that may be the most important thing about the myths behind Asterix and Obelix. They are not just jokes about the past, they are jokes about national memory, colonial pressure, cultural pride, and the desire to believe that a small group of people can keep their dignity intact in a world that keeps expanding around them. That is why the comics became so beloved. They are funny, yes, but they are also about the emotional comfort of resistance. Tiny resistance, sure. Ridiculous resistance. Resistance with helmets and roast boar. But resistance all the same. So as we settle into this little Gaulish universe, remember the real trick of Asterix and Obelix. They take history, folklore, and national myth, stir them together, and then serve the result with a wink. Rome becomes too big, the village becomes too stubborn, Obelix becomes too strong, Asterix becomes too clever, and somewhere in the middle of all that, ancient Gaul turns into a bedtime story about refusing to disappear. Now that we have the village, the Romans, and the basic myth of stubbornness in place, it is time to drift into the part where the comics borrow from real ancient Gaul, then cheerfully rearrange it for maximum bedtime charm. The real Gauls were not cartoon peasants in striped trousers. They were Celtic peoples living across a wide region of Europe, with tribal identities, shifting alliances, and a long history of conflict, both with one another and with Rome. That is the historical skeleton under the comic's very silly coat. One of the biggest myths the comics play with is the idea of the Gauls as a single, united nation. They were not. They were a collection of tribes, and that is part of what made Caesar's conquest possible in the first place. The real history is a lot less tidy than the comic village suggests, because real societies rarely agree to become symbols on schedule. Still, the village works as a kind of distilled memory of local independence, the fantasy of people who refuse to vanish into an empire's paperwork. The historical Gauls also had a real martial reputation, which the comics exaggerate in all the right ways. Ancient authors, especially Roman ones, often portrayed them as fierce and brave, though that portrait was filtered through Roman anxiety and admiration in equal measure. The comic version gives us warriors who are loud, impulsive, and gloriously resistant to discipline. That caricature is not history exactly, but it does echo Roman descriptions of Gallic warfare as less rigid than the legion's own style. There is also the matter of Vercingetorix, the great Gallic leader who united tribes against Caesar. He is one of the few truly historical figures whose presence resonates directly through the comic world. His name helped shape the comic convention of ending Gaulish names in X, which is one of those little details that looks like pure invention until you realize it is anchored in a real person who became a symbol of resistance. History loves handing fiction just enough material to get ideas from. Let's float over to the Druids, because the series would not be the same without them. The real Druids were important figures in Celtic society, associated with religion, law, memory, and elite learning. The comic turns that role into one magical old man in a white robe who knows everything, brews a potion, and can solve most problems by quietly standing near a cauldron. It is absurd, yes, but it is also a good example of how folklore can compress an entire social class into a single lovable nuisance. The magic potion itself is obviously fictional, but the way it works as a myth is very old-fashioned. It stands in for local knowledge, communal strength, and the fantasy of a small group gaining superhuman confidence when they need it most. The potion is also useful because it gives the stories a recurring explanation for why the village survives impossible odds. That kind of narrative device is not about realism, it is about emotional architecture. It says, our people endure because they have something Rome does not understand, convenient, and also deeply satisfying. Obelix, in that framework, becomes more than a big funny man. He becomes a living myth of excess, appetite, and lasting strength. His fondness for boar, his endless physical energy, and his blunt sincerity all echo the comic's idealized version of the ancient world as both rough and hardy. Real Gaulish life was harder and less picturesque, but the comic turns that material world into a gentle ritual of eating, joking, and outlasting the empire through sheer social glue. And then there is Rome, that endlessly patient machine. In the comics, Roman soldiers spend a lot of time being confused, bruised, and embarrassed, which is a very funny inversion of historical reality. Rome was the more powerful force by far. The legions were disciplined, organized, and part of a long imperial system that eventually transformed Gaul into a Romanized province. But in the comic, Rome is repeatedly made ridiculous by a tiny village that refuses to behave itself. That inversion is the heart of the joke. Still, The historical process matters. Gaul did become Gallo-Roman over time. Local elites adapted to Roman administration. Cities developed, trade expanded, and cultural mixing changed the region in ways that were slow, uneven, and completely unfit for a punchline. The comics condense that whole transformation into a recurring bedtime skirmish where cultural identity wins because it is stubborn and funny, which, if you think about it, is exactly the kind of story people tell when they want history to feel survivable. So the myths behind Asterix and Obelix are not just about ancient Gaul, they are about how modern people remember conquest, identity, and the appeal of underdogs who never quite surrender. The real world gave the comics their names, their setting, their symbolism, and their historical tension. The comics then turned those ingredients into something lighter, warmer, and a little more ridiculous. And that is why the myth still works. It is not trying to be the past. It is trying to make the past feel like a place where stubbornness is a kind of victory. Now we can drift from the ancient village itself to the much larger myth it serves in modern memory, because Asterix is not only about Gaul, it is about France remembering Gaul, rewriting Gaul, and then laughing at the rewriting while keeping the sentimental parts anyway. That is the real trick. The comics are full of ancient helmets and Roman roads, but their deeper subject is modern identity, especially the idea that a small and supposedly stubborn people can keep its character even under pressure. This is why the series feels so layered, even when it looks effortless. Goscinny and Uderzo were not just making a historical joke, they were working with a national myth that French school children had absorbed for generations. Our ancestors, the Gauls. The comic draws on that old educational narrative and then gently mocks it, especially by showing the Gauls as both heroic and ridiculous. They are brave, yes, but also bickering, gluttonous, and a little too proud of themselves, which is exactly the kind of affectionate criticism a culture makes when it is talking to itself. The village feast at the end of every story matters more than it first appears. It is not just a punchline, it is a ritual of communal restoration. Rome may loom over the landscape, but the final scene always returns to local social life, with food, laughter, and an absurdly stable, emotional rhythm. That ending tells you what the real fantasy is. Not military victory, but social continuity. The village survives because it keeps eating together, arguing together, and refusing to become a bureaucratic suburb of empire. There is also a nice historical irony in how Asterix became a symbol of cultural resilience. The comic itself was produced in post-war France, a society still wrestling with occupation, collaboration, nationalism, and the larger question of what Frenchness actually means. So, when Asterix defeats Romans over and over, the story is doing more than entertaining children. It is staging a small, funny, emotionally manageable version of resistance. The empire becomes a joke, and the village becomes a memory of dignity. Very handy, really, when a nation is in the mood to feel proud without becoming too solemn about it. Obelix fits into this modern symbolism in a surprisingly elegant way. He is not refined, intellectual, or politically subtle. He is physical, loyal, generous, and often more emotionally direct than everyone else in the room. That makes him an ideal comic figure for a story about local belonging. He is the man who carries the stones, enjoys the feast, and never quite understands why there needs to be so much explanation. In the mythic structure of the series, he is the body of the village, while Asterix is its wit. Together, they cover the whole argument. The real historical Gauls were obviously more complicated. They lived in tribes, had their own hierarchies, and were part of a wider Celtic world that extended far beyond the comic panel. But the comic's simplification is part of its power. It transforms a messy ancient past into a story with emotional logic, a community under pressure, a local culture resisting domination, and a set of rituals that keep identity alive. That logic is one reason the book's translated so well across Europe and beyond. The specific jokes may change, but the central feeling is instantly recognizable. And then there is the matter of the stereotypes. Asterix is famous for sending the heroes abroad and turning different peoples into broad comic portraits. That can feel cheeky, even crude, but it also reveals how the series thinks about identity. Every culture is seen through exaggeration, including the Gauls themselves. The joke is never only about them, it is also about us, and that is what gives the books enough self-awareness to keep working. The comic is not above stereotypes, it is built from them, then made a little more human by irony. So, when people ask why Asterix and Obelix endure, part of the answer is history, and part is comfort. They give readers a fantasy of communal endurance, without asking them to believe in perfection. The village is flawed, argumentative, and full of appetites. Rome is powerful, organized, and ultimately annoying. Between the two, the comics choose the side that makes dinner together seem like a political act, which, in a very quiet way, is a perfect myth for bedtime. And now, we come to the part where Asterix stops being only a comic about ancient Gauls and becomes a very neat mirror for modern France, which is a little sneaky, but also very effective. The village is no longer just a village. It becomes a symbol, a little resistant pocket of identity that keeps standing while bigger powers march around it and pretend history will be simple if they just keep pressing forward. Naturally, history never cooperates with that. That symbolic power matters because Asterix was born in the post-war period when France was still sorting through its memories of occupation, collaboration, resistance, and national pride. The comic's tiny Gaulish community offered an emotional shape for a larger cultural question. What does it mean to remain yourself under pressure? The answer the series gives is very French, very witty, and just self-aware enough to avoid becoming pure propaganda. It says that identity can survive, but only if it keeps laughing at itself a little. That is part of why the series works across political lines too. The books can be read as nationalist, anti-imperial, anti-bureaucratic, anti-establishment, or even simply anti-nonsense, depending on who is reading and which Roman soldier just got launched into the shrubbery. The comic does not lock itself into one ideology. It behaves more like a cultural machine for turning pressure into parody. Asterix becomes the little figure who can stand in for resistance of many kinds without becoming solemn enough to be boring. A very useful trick, honestly. The creators themselves were also part of the story. René Goscinny and Albert Uderzo were both children of immigrant backgrounds, and that matters more than it first seems. Their outsider perspective helped them treat Frenchness as something that could be observed, joked about, and lovingly exaggerated rather than treated as a sacred monument. That makes the series feel more intelligent than a simple patriotic mascot. It is a playful portrait of national identity drawn by people who knew identity could be complicated, negotiated, and sometimes a little awkward around the edges. One of the nicest examples of this is the druid Getafix, who resembles the old school teacher or moral guide in spirit as much as the mystical priest of ancient imagination. The village itself also carries traces of democratic, communal values, which is why it feels less like a feudal fantasy and more like a tiny self-governing society with a very aggressive social calendar. The chief is there, yes, but so is the village's habit of collective participation, mutual irritation, and shared meals. It is governance by roast boar and social expectation, which is probably more effective than many systems we could name. That success also turned Asterix into a kind of museum of modern memory. Later uses of Gallic symbols in French culture treated Vercingetorix and Asterix very differently, depending on whether the message was nationalist, popular, ironic, or commercially cheerful. Asterix is not simply a mascot of ancient Gaul. He is a modern cultural shorthand for resilience without pomposity, a tiny resistance figure with enough wit to keep the empire looking foolish, which is a very attractive concept if you've ever felt outnumbered by the world. So the myths behind Asterix and Obelix are not just ancient myths. They are modern ones wearing helmets. They tell a story about cultural memory, post-war identity, and the joy of imagining that stubborn little communities can outlast large, organized systems by staying clever, hungry, and just difficult enough to be memorable. That is why the books remain funny. That is why they remain useful. And that is why a comic about Roman occupation can still feel like a bedtime story about surviving the pressure of history without losing your sense of absurdity. Hey guys, tonight we begin somewhere quiet, somewhere almost forgettable, which is exactly how most of history's practical survival systems prefer to exist. Not in grand castles, not in dramatic battlefields, but in the background of everyday life, where someone, somewhere, is just trying to solve a very simple problem in a very complicated world. And in feudal Japan, that problem was not always war or politics or honor or any of the poetic ideas we like to attach to the past. Sometimes it was just hunger, and more specifically, how do you stay alive, functional, and invisible at the same time when your job requires you to move constantly, avoid attention, and never stay in one place long enough to enjoy a proper meal? That is where the Shinobi ration system quietly begins. Not as legend, not as mythology, but as logistics disguised as survival. The Shinobi, often romanticized today as shadow warriors or cinematic figures leaping across rooftops under moonlight, were in reality operating under extremely practical constraints. They could not afford to be slowed down by cooking. They could not risk smoke from fire. They could not carry heavy supplies that would affect movement. And they absolutely could not rely on consistent access to food. So what they developed instead was not a cuisine, but a survival strategy in edible form. Food became compressed time. Every ration was essentially a stored moment of energy meant to be released only when the body demanded it, and even then in the most efficient way possible. Rice formed the foundation of this system, but not the soft, freshly cooked rice we usually imagine today. Instead, it was processed, dried, or compacted into forms that could survive long journeys without spoiling or attracting attention. This transformation is important because it shows us something subtle about shinobi life. They were not eating for pleasure, they were eating for continuation. Race stopped being a meal and became a unit of endurance, something closer to fuel than food, something designed to extend motion rather than interrupt it. And once you start seeing it this way, the entire concept of eating in shinobi culture changes shape. It becomes less of a ritual and more of a calculation. Alongside rice, salt played a surprisingly central role, not because it was glamorous or interesting, but because it was essential. Salt preserved food, extended shelf life, and made it possible to carry supplies across long distances without decay. But it also had a secondary effect that mattered just as much in the field. It increased thirst, and thirst meant water management, and water management meant planning. So even something as simple as a salted ration introduced a chain of logistical decisions that had to be considered before a mission even began. This is one of those quiet details that makes shinobi survival systems feel almost modern in their logic. Nothing exists in isolation. Every advantage comes with a cost, and every cost must be carried forward mentally. Then there were preserved items, like dried fish and pickled vegetables, chosen not for taste but for durability. In a world without refrigeration, durability was everything. If something could survive heat, humidity, time, and travel, it was valuable. It did not matter whether it was enjoyable. What mattered was whether it still existed when needed. And shinobi rations were built entirely on that principle. Food was not about satisfaction, it was about reliability under pressure. And reliability, in their world, was the difference between success and exposure. Now, what makes this system particularly interesting is not just what they ate, but how carefully everything was minimized. There was no excess, no decoration, no unnecessary variety. Everything had a purpose, and anything that did not serve stealth, endurance, or portability was removed. This is why shinobi rations feel almost engineered rather than cooked. They were designed like tools, not meals. Each component had a job. Some provided energy, some preserved the others, some simply existed to make sure nothing spoiled too quickly. It is a system that reflects a very specific mindset, one where survival is not reactive but pre-planned, almost like a quiet contract between the body and the mission. And then there's the question of portability, which might sound simple at first, but becomes far more complex when you think about real movement through real terrain. Shinobi could not carry bulky containers. They could not afford noise. They could not afford leaks or smells or anything that might reveal them. So food had to be physically stable and discreet. It had to disappear into clothing, into small compartments, into places where it would not interfere with movement. And this requirement alone reshaped how food was prepared. Everything had to be compact, silent, and forgettable until the exact moment it was needed. There is also a psychological layer to all of this that is often overlooked. When food loses its identity as comfort and becomes purely functional, it changes the relationship between the body and survival. Hunger is no longer something to enjoy or delay for pleasure. It becomes a signal that must be managed efficiently. Eating becomes maintenance rather than experience. And over time, this likely created a very different emotional relationship with food. compared to ordinary life. Not worse or better, just stripped down to function. And perhaps that is the most consistent theme in everything surrounding Shinobi rations. Reduction. Everything is reduced to its most essential form. Taste is reduced to necessity. Variety is reduced to reliability. Eating is reduced to timing. And survival is reduced to planning. It is a system built on removing everything that is not strictly required until only what is essential remains. So, when we talk about Shinobi special rations, we are not really talking about food in the traditional sense. We are talking about a hidden infrastructure of survival, one that allowed people to move through hostile environments without being seen, without being heard, and without needing to stop. It is a reminder that behind every legend, behind every shadow story, there is always something extremely practical, holding everything together. And in this case, it was not magic, not mystery, not mythology. It was rice, salt, preservation, and very careful planning. And as we continue, we will start to see how these rations were actually used in the field, how they were consumed during movement, and how even the act of eating had to be adjusted to match the demands of stealth, timing, and silence, where food stops being an abstract idea and starts becoming something that has to be managed in real time, in real environments, with real consequences if done incorrectly. Because once a shinobi was out in the field, there was no comfortable pause button, no proper meal break, and definitely no safe dining space waiting somewhere in the forest, which means eating itself had to be redesigned into something that could exist inside movement rather than interrupt it. And this is where shinobi rations start showing their second layer of purpose. Not just storage, but timing. Not just preservation, but behavior control. Because even hunger had to be negotiated carefully when silence and invisibility were part of the job description. In the field, a shinobi did not sit down to eat in any normal sense. Instead, they consumed food in fragments, small controlled portions taken at moments when movement allowed it, often during brief pauses that were chosen not because they were comfortable, but because they were strategically safe. And even then, the act of eating had to be quiet, almost invisible, with minimal chewing, minimal handling, and absolutely no waste that could leave traces behind, which creates this very strange image of survival, where the body is constantly being refueled, but never allowed the dignity of rest, like a system running in low power mode while still expected to perform complex tasks in unpredictable conditions. This is also where the design of the rations themselves becomes more impressive, because they were not just preserved for long life, but also shaped for silent consumption, meaning they could be eaten without strong smell, without loud preparation, and without generating obvious signals that someone nearby might notice. And this matters more than it first appears, because in feudal environments, even something as small as the smell of food or the sound of movement could reveal presence, and for a shinobi revelation equals failure. So every bite had to be engineered, not just for energy delivery, but for invisibility. Water management becomes the next quiet problem in this system, because salted and preserved foods naturally increase thirst, and thirst cannot always be answered immediately in the field, which means shinobi had to plan hydration the same way they planned movement, anticipating when water would be available and controlling consumption so that the body did not become desperate at the wrong time, because desperation leads to mistakes, and mistakes lead to exposure, and exposure in their line of work was rarely forgiving. So even something as simple as drinking water becomes part of a larger rhythm of controlled survival rather than spontaneous need. There is also a pacing aspect to this that is often overlooked because Shinobi movement was not constant high-speed action, like modern interpretations suggest. It was often slow, deliberate, and interrupted by long periods of observation, waiting, and environmental reading, which means food consumption had to fit into that rhythm as well, not as a break from activity, but as a background process that happened alongside it, almost like refueling while still in motion, which again reinforces the idea that Shinobi life was less about dramatic bursts of action and more about sustained, quiet endurance over long periods of uncertainty. Another important detail is how carefully Shinobi avoided anything that could create waste or traceable evidence, because leftover food, scraps, wrappers in modern terms, or even disturbed natural elements could reveal presence to someone who knew how to look. So consumption had to be clean, minimal, and fully contained, leaving nothing behind that could be followed, which turns eating into a kind of disappearance ritual, where even the act of nourishment is erased as soon as it happens. And this level of discipline shows just how integrated stealth was into every aspect of their existence. As we move further into this idea, it becomes clear that Shinobi rations were not just about feeding the body, but about controlling its behavior under stress, because hunger, fatigue, and thirst all influence decision making, and in environments where a single wrong decision could end a mission, controlling those variables becomes essential. So the food system becomes a form of psychological support as much as physical support, smoothing out the body's natural fluctuations so the mind can remain focused on navigation, observation, and avoidance. There is also something quietly ironic about the entire system, because while shinobi are often imagined as mysterious and unpredictable, their survival actually depended on extreme predictability in their own planning. Every ration portion was calculated, every consumption moment was anticipated, every movement had to account for energy levels, and in that sense their life was not chaotic at all, but carefully structured behind the scenes, almost like a silent algorithm running underneath the visible world of feudal politics and conflict. And when you look at it from this angle, even eating becomes a kind of discipline training, where the goal is not satisfaction but maintenance, not pleasure but stability. And this creates a very different mindset compared to ordinary life, because food no longer represents comfort or reward. It represents continuity, the ability to keep going without interruption. And that continuity is what defines whether a mission succeeds or fails long before any actual confrontation ever happens. So, as we continue forward in this story, we start to see shinobi rations not as simple preserved meals, but as part of a larger survival architecture that governs movement, timing, and decision making in the field. And in the next part, we will begin to explore how these rations were actually prepared before missions and what kind of thinking went into selecting what would and would not be carried into the unknown. Now we drift a little backward in time, before the forest, before the night movement, before the silence of field survival, because nothing about Shinobi rations actually begins in the moment of use. It begins much earlier, in preparation, in quiet planning, in the kind of careful thinking that does not look dramatic from the outside, but decides everything that happens later. And in feudal Japan, this preparation was not casual at all. It was structured, deliberate, and shaped by the understanding that once a shinobi stepped into a mission environment, there would be no correction, no resupply, and no second chance to rethink what had already been carried, which means every piece of food had to be chosen with almost uncomfortable precision. The selection process for rations started with a very simple question that sounds almost boring, but carries a lot of weight underneath it, which is how long is the mission expected to last? Because duration determined everything, not just quantity, but composition. And this is where shinobi thinking becomes very methodical, almost like early field logistics, where you are not just packing food, but building a survival timeline inside a small bundle, estimating how many hours of movement, how many nights of hiding, how many moments of silence will need to be supported by what you carry on your body. And this transforms food selection into a kind of prediction exercise about the future. Once duration was estimated, the next step was balance, because shinobi rations could not rely on a single type of food. Even something as reliable as rice had limits. So planners had to combine energy sources, preservation methods, and consumption styles into one unified system, which is why we see combinations of dried rice, salted components, preserved vegetables, and occasionally protein sources like dried fish, all arranged not for taste harmony, but for functional diversity, ensuring that no single failure point could collapse the entire system during a mission, because redundancy was not optional. It was survival logic. Packing itself was another layer of discipline, because how food was physically arranged mattered just as much as what food was chosen. Since Shinobi had to carry everything in a way that did not interfere with movement, did not create noise, and did not shift weight unpredictably during travel. So rations were distributed across clothing, small compartments, and hidden storage spaces designed for stability and silence. And this is where we start to see how even clothing and food were part of the same system, both engineered for invisibility rather than appearance. There was also a strong emphasis on minimizing sensory output, especially smell, because scent is one of the easiest ways to detect human presence in natural environments, and preserved foods can sometimes produce strong odors if not carefully selected or prepared. So shinobi had to be extremely aware of what their food would broadcast into the environment, which again pushes us into a very modern way of thinking where logistics includes environmental interaction, not just internal function, and everything is evaluated not only by how it works, but by what it reveals. Another interesting aspect of preparation was mental conditioning, because choosing and packing rations was not just physical work, it was psychological reinforcement, a way of reminding the shinobi what kind of environment they were entering, where comfort would not exist, and where every resource had to be rationed carefully. And in that sense, the food preparation process itself becomes part of training, a quiet ritual that reinforces discipline before the mission even begins, shaping expectations so that the body and mind are already aligned with the demands of survival. And then there's the question of contingency, because no matter how carefully a mission is planned, unpredictability is always present. So Shinobi often prepared for worst-case scenarios by carrying small emergency portions that were not meant for regular consumption, but for moments of crisis when energy levels dropped unexpectedly or when missions extended beyond their original time frame. And this concept of backup survival within survival shows just how layered their planning systems were, where even the safety net has its own safety net. What becomes clear at this stage is that Shinobi rations were never just about feeding a person in the field. They were about designing a complete, mobile survival environment that could function independently of external support, and every decision made before departure directly influenced how smoothly that system would operate under stress, which means preparation was not a prelude to action. It was already part of the mission itself, just happening in a quieter space. And as we move forward, we will begin to look at what happens when these carefully prepared systems are actually put under pressure in real field conditions, where theory meets reality and where even the best preparation is tested by distance, time, and uncertainty. Now, we finally enter the part where everything prepared beforehand stops being theory and starts becoming lived experience. Because once a shinobi is actually inside a mission environment, all the careful planning, all the ration selection, and all the quiet preparation gets tested in the simplest and most unforgiving way possible, which is whether the body can continue moving without breaking the rhythm of silence and without exposing itself to unnecessary risk. And this is where shinobi rations reveal their real purpose, not as stored food, but as controlled survival pacing inside a constantly shifting environment. Inside a mission, time does not feel stable. It stretches and compresses depending on movement, observation, and waiting. And food consumption has to adapt to that instability, which means eating becomes irregular but intentional, not tied to traditional meal times, but instead tied to moments of safety that are brief and unpredictable. And even then, the act of eating is never complete or relaxed. It is partial, cautious, and always done with awareness of surroundings. Because in a world where being noticed equals failure, even chewing too loudly can become a liability that must be managed. Inside a mission, time does not feel stable. It stretches and compresses depending on movement, observation, and waiting. And food consumption has to adapt to that instability, which means eating becomes irregular but intentional, not tied to traditional meal times, but instead tied to moments of safety that are brief and unpredictable. And even then, the act of eating is never complete or relaxed. It is partial, cautious, and always done with awareness of surroundings. Because in a world where being noticed equals failure, even chewing too loudly can become a liability that must be managed. The shinobi body in this state is constantly balancing three competing needs: movement, energy, and concealment, and rations exist to stabilize that balance just enough to prevent collapse. So food is consumed in small controlled fragments that prevent fatigue from building too quickly, while also avoiding any behavior that could interrupt stealth. And this creates a very different relationship with hunger, because hunger is no longer something that demands immediate satisfaction. It becomes something that is negotiated with time, delayed until conditions are appropriate, and managed rather than solved. Water becomes even more important inside the mission phase because preserved foods continue to create thirst, and thirst during movement is not just discomfort, but a strategic vulnerability. So Shinobi develop an almost instinctive awareness of hydration timing, estimating when water can be safely consumed and when it must be conserved. And this adds another invisible layer of calculation to every moment of field activity, because even basic bodily needs are now integrated into operational planning. There is also the constant presence of environmental awareness, because eating is not just a personal act in this context. It is something that interacts with the surroundings, producing scent, movement, and sometimes sound, all of which must be minimized. So Shinobi often choose positions for consumption based on concealment rather than comfort, meaning they might eat while partially hidden, while observing surroundings, or while still technically in motion, which removes the traditional separation between rest and action entirely. Fatigue management becomes a central theme here as well, because food is not only about energy, but about preventing mistakes, and mistakes in a mission environment are rarely minor. They compound quickly, so rations are consumed not just when hunger appears, but when performance begins to decline, creating a proactive rather than reactive system of body maintenance, which is again a reflection of the broader Shinobi philosophy, where anticipation is more valuable than response. Another subtle detail is emotional detachment from consumption, because when food is reduced to function rather than enjoyment, it also reduces emotional dependence on comfort, which may help maintain focus in stressful environments. So eating becomes a neutral activity, neither rewarding nor punishing, just a necessary maintenance cycle that supports continuation. And this neutrality is important because emotional spikes can interfere with decision making in situations where calm consistency is required. And as missions extend over longer durations, the ration system begins to show its limits as well, because no matter how well food is preserved or how carefully it is planned, resources are always finite, which means Shinobi must constantly reassess consumption rates, adjust expectations, and adapt behavior based on remaining supplies, turning ration management into an ongoing background calculation that runs alongside movement and observation. What emerges from all of this is a very clear picture of Shinobi life inside missions, where survival is not a single act, but a continuous process of adjustment, and food is not an event, but a tool that keeps that process stable enough to continue. And in this way, Shinobi rations are not just about what was carried into the field, but about how that carried system behaves when reality starts applying pressure. And as we continue forward, we will start looking at what happens when things do not go according to plan, when missions extend beyond expectations, and when rations become not just support, but the last remaining structure holding survival together. And as we reach the end of this quiet look into the world of Shinobi rations, what we are really left with is not a story about food in the ordinary sense, but a reminder that survival in feudal Japan was often less about dramatic combat and more about invisible systems working in the background to keep a person moving through uncertainty, where every grain of rice, every preserved fragment of fish, every pinch of salt was not about taste or tradition, but about time itself, carefully packaged to something portable enough to carry through forests, towns, and shadows without ever announcing its presence. And when you step back from all the details, what becomes clear is that the Shinobi ration system was essentially a quiet philosophy of endurance built on reduction, discipline, and anticipation, where eating was no longer a moment of comfort, but a controlled function designed to sustain invisibility and motion. And in that sense, the real secret of the shinobi was never just stealth techniques or legendary skills, but the ability to manage their own human needs so precisely that even hunger and fatigue became tools rather than obstacles, allowing them to exist in a space where they were always present in action, but almost absent in trace. And that is perhaps the most understated form of survival history has ever produced.